The silence in the solicitor's office was thicker than the afternoon drizzle pattering against the Georgian windows. Charlotte, my cousin, sat across from me in her pristine Burberry coat, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked the picture of grief, though I suspected it was more for appearances than genuine sorrow. Mr. Pemberton, Mother's longtime solicitor, cleared his throat, a sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the oak-paneled room lined with dusty legal tomes. "As you both know," he began, his voice carrying that particular gravity reserved for such occasions, "your mother, Lady Margaret Ashworth, has passed away peacefully at the age of 73. We're gathered today to read her last will and testament, as requested in her final instructions." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mother had been gone for only a week, and the grief was still a raw, gaping wound that seemed to tear open afresh each morning. I hadn't slept properly since the funeral, barely managed a bite of toast each day, surviving mainly on tea and the sympathetic casseroles brought by neighbors. The thought of sorting through her belongings at the family estate in the Cotswolds, let alone dealing with the labyrinthine legalities of her death, felt utterly overwhelming. The funeral itself had been a blur of black clothing and whispered condolences. I remembered standing at the graveside in Chipping Campden churchyard, watching as they lowered her mahogany coffin into the earth beside Father's grave. Charlotte had stood beside me, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting sympathies from distant relatives and family friends with practiced grace. Even in grief, she possessed an elegance I'd never quite managed to achieve. Mr. Pemberton adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and began to read from the official document, his voice taking on that particular cadence solicitors use when reading wills. The words blurred together in a maze of legal jargon I barely understood, whereas and heretofore, bequests, and beneficiaries. Instead, I found myself studying Charlotte's face. She sat so still, so composed, her breathing shallow and controlled, almost expectant. I thought about our childhood together, racing through the corridors of Willowbrook Manor during school holidays, playing hide-and-seek in the conservatory amongst Mother's prized orchids. Charlotte had always been the prettier one, the more charming one, the one who could make the adults laugh with her witty observations. Mother had doted on her in a way that sometimes made me feel like an outsider in my own home. Then came the part that made my stomach plummet like a stone dropped into a well. To my beloved niece, Charlotte Elizabeth Ashworth, Mr. Pemberton read in his measured tone, "I bequeath my estate at Willowbrook Manor in its entirety, including all furnishings, artwork, and grounds. Additionally, I leave her all savings accounts held at Coutts Bank, totaling approximately £1.7 million, my late mother's emerald brooch and matching earrings, and all remaining possessions not otherwise specified." The room began to spin, the afternoon light filtering through the windows, seeming to dim and brighten erratically. Charlotte inherited everything? Everything? The Manor Mother had lovingly restored room by room over 3 decades, painstakingly choosing every piece of William Morris wallpaper, every antique piece of furniture. The savings she'd carefully accumulated through shrewd investments and frugal living. Even the emerald brooch that had been passed down through 5 generations of Ashworth women, which I'd assumed would naturally come to me as her daughter. I couldn't believe it. My mouth felt dry as cotton wool, and I had to resist the urge to laugh hysterically at the absurdity of it all. I searched Charlotte's face desperately for some sign of surprise, of guilt, of anything that might suggest she was as shocked as I was. But her expression remained an unreadable mask, rather like a porcelain doll in a shop window, beautiful, but utterly emotionless. "And to my daughter," Mr. Pemberton continued, and my heart leaped with desperate hope, "I leave the sum of £5,000, along with my personal effects and correspondence, and my heartfelt love." £5,000. After a lifetime of being her daughter, of caring for her through countless illnesses, of sacrificing my own dreams to stay close to home, £5,000. It was barely enough to cover the funeral expenses I'd already paid. Mr. Pemberton continued outlining the legal procedures, discussing probate and tax implications, but I heard nothing beyond the rushing of blood in my ears. I was utterly floored, as if someone had pulled a Persian rug out from under my feet. This couldn't be right. Mother loved me, didn't she? We were close, weren't we? I'd been the one who'd driven her to doctor's appointments when her arthritis flared up, who'd spent weekends helping her tend the rose garden, who'd listened to her stories about the war years and her courtship with father. The meeting concluded swiftly after that bombshell. Mr. Pemberton offered his condolences with typical British reserve, his handshake firm but perfunctory. Charlotte gave me what felt like a calculated embrace, her expensive perfume, Chanel No. 5, I noticed, overwhelming my senses. Then I found myself standing on the pavement outside his chambers in Lincoln's Inn, the harsh reality crashing down like a sudden London downpour on an otherwise pleasant day. People hurried past me with umbrellas and briefcases, going about their ordinary lives while mine had just been turned completely upside down. A red double-decker bus rumbled past, splashing puddle water dangerously close to my shoes. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. Something felt terribly, fundamentally wrong. The will reading had been rushed, almost impersonal, lacking the warmth and attention to detail that Mr. Pemberton usually displayed. He'd been Mother's solicitor for nearly 20 years, had helped draft her previous wills, and I remembered him being far more thorough and considerate during Father's estate proceedings. Today, he'd seemed almost eager to get the whole business over with, glancing repeatedly at his pocket watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. And Charlotte, her composure was deeply unsettling. In all our years growing up together, I'd never seen her maintain such perfect emotional control. She was usually quite dramatic, given to theatrical sighs and elaborate displays of feeling. Yet today, faced with inheriting a fortune, she'd shown all the emotion of someone reading the weather forecast. I decided then and there, standing on that gray London street corner, that I wouldn't simply accept this. I would go through Mother's belongings at Willowbrook with a fine-tooth comb, search every room, every drawer, every hidden corner of that sprawling manor. Perhaps there was a mistake. Perhaps there was some explanation that would make sense of this bewildering situation. Perhaps there was more to this story than met the eye. The drive down to the Cotswolds the following morning felt like a journey into my past. I took the same route Mother and I had traveled countless times, through the suburbs of London, past the rolling green hills of Oxfordshire, until the honey-colored stone cottages of Chipping Campden came into view. Every mile brought back memories, Mother pointing out landmarks, singing along to Radio 4, stopping at that little tea room in Burford for scones and clotted cream. Willowbrook Manor stood at the end of a long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees, their branches creating a natural cathedral overhead. The house itself was a perfect example of Cotswold architecture, built from the local limestone that seemed to glow golden in the morning sunlight. Climbing roses, Mother's pride and joy, covered much of the front facade, though they looked rather neglected now, with deadheads that should have been removed weeks ago. The house felt empty and cold, without Mother's presence, like a beautiful shell with its soul removed. Every room held memories of her. The kitchen where she'd taught me to make proper Yorkshire pudding, the library where she'd read to me on rainy afternoons, the conservatory where she'd spent hours tending her orchids and writing in her leather-bound journal. I wandered through the familiar rooms, touching her things with something approaching reverence, trying to conjure her spirit amongst the chintz cushions and family portraits. The grandfather clock in the hallway still chimed on the hour, its steady tick-tock the only sound breaking the profound silence. I began my search in the morning room, Mother's favorite spot for breakfast and correspondence. She'd always been meticulous about her papers, filing everything in neat categories with her careful handwriting, labeling each folder. I methodically searched through drawers, cabinets, and the antique escritoire where she'd kept her personal correspondence. Hours passed as I combed through decades of accumulated papers. I found old photographs in shoeboxes, holidays in Scotland, Christmas mornings, my graduation from university. There were letters from distant relatives in Australia, thank you notes from various charities she'd supported, programs from village fed events she'd helped organize. I discovered her collection of pressed flowers between the pages of poetry books, trinkets from her travels with Father before I was born, but nothing that shed any light on the will. The afternoon wore on, and I expanded my search to other rooms. Mother's bedroom revealed little beyond her jewelry box, now nearly empty since Charlotte apparently inherited most of the valuable pieces, and some old love letters from Father tied with a faded blue ribbon. The study contained business papers and household accounts, all perfectly organized and entirely unremarkable. Exhausted and rather disheartened, I finally sank into Mother's favorite armchair in the sitting room and stared at the wall opposite. The room was decorated with dozens of family photographs spanning several generations: weddings, christenings, school photographs, holiday snaps. My gaze fell upon a framed photograph of Mother and me, taken years ago during a holiday in Cornwall when I was about 20. I remembered that day so vividly. We'd been staying in a little bed and breakfast in St. Ives, and Mother had been in uncommonly high spirits. The warmth of the sun on our faces, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below, her laughter carrying on the sea breeze as we'd posed for a passing tourist who'd offered to take our picture. It had been one of those perfect moments that seemed to crystallize everything good about our relationship. On impulse, driven by nothing more than nostalgia and a desire to hold something connected to happier times, I reached up and lifted the photograph from the wall. As I did, I noticed something odd. The frame felt unusually heavy for its size, heavier than the similar frames surrounding it. Curious, I turned it over and examined the back carefully, running my fingers along the edges of the backing. That's when I spotted it. A piece of paper, carefully taped to the back of the frame with yellowing sellotape, hidden completely from view. My heart began to race as I realized what this might be. With trembling hands that seemed to belong to someone else, I carefully peeled back the tape, trying not to damage whatever was hidden beneath. The paper came free, with a soft, tearing sound, and I unfolded it with the reverence one might reserve for handling an ancient manuscript. It was another page, a second page of the will, and what it revealed about Charlotte, about Mother, about our entire family. Well, let's just say it shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. The paper was the same legal stationery as the will we'd heard read in Mr. Pemberton's office, slightly yellowed with age and bearing Mother's distinctive letterhead. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though slightly shakier than usual, as if she'd been writing under tremendous emotional stress. My eyes scanned the words desperately, the silence in the room amplified by my thundering heartbeat. As an addendum to the previous page of my last will and testament, it began. I, Lady Margaret Elizabeth Ashworth, being of sound mind and body, do hereby stipulate the following additional provisions to be enacted upon my death. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the precious document. An addendum? So Charlotte didn't inherit everything after all? Hope, which I'd barely dared to feel since leaving Mr. Pemberton's office, began to bloom in my chest like a flower opening to sunlight. I continued reading, each word burning itself into my memory with crystal clarity. Apparently, the manor and savings were to be divided equally between Charlotte and myself, not the wholesale inheritance of everything that had been read aloud yesterday. The emerald brooch and earrings, moreover, were explicitly mine, described as a symbol of the enduring love between mother and daughter and a reminder of bonds that no other person can sever or diminish. Tears began streaming down my face, hot and immediate. Not tears of sadness this time, but of relief and, strangely, vindication. Mother hadn't forgotten me after all. She hadn't chosen Charlotte over her own flesh and blood. She knew. She knew the truth about our relationship, about Charlotte's place in the family, about everything that had transpired over the years. But then the next paragraph hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs as surely as if someone had struck me across the chest. I also stipulate that should Charlotte marry James Henry Whitmore before her 30th birthday, her portion of the inheritance shall be increased by 25%. This additional amount shall be deducted from my daughter's share as compensation for the care, attention, and devotion that Charlotte has shown to James over the years, and in recognition of the sacrifice she has made in putting his happiness above her own. James. The name reverberated through my mind like a church bell tolling, bringing with it a flood of memories I'd spent years trying to bury. James Henry Whitmore, my former fiancé from university, the man I'd loved with every fiber of my being and whom Charlotte had systematically and deliberately stolen from me. James, with his unruly dark hair and those green eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. James, who'd written me poetry on scraps of paper and left them in my textbooks for me to find. James, who'd proposed to me on a foggy December evening outside the British Library, going down on one knee right there on the wet pavement while Christmas shoppers hurried past. I remembered so clearly the night Charlotte and James first got together, though at the time I hadn't understood the full significance of what I was witnessing. It was at Charlotte's 24th birthday party, and I'd invited James with the specific intention of finally introducing him to Mother and getting her blessing for our engagement. We'd been together for 2 years by then, and I was desperately hoping she'd approve of my choice. The party was held at Charlotte's flat in Kensington, a spacious place that Mother helped her afford. When I arrived that evening, fashionably late after helping Mother with some charity event, the sound of jazz music and sophisticated laughter greeted me at the door. Charlotte had always known how to throw a party, the right mix of people, the perfect lighting, enough champagne to make everyone feel witty and attractive. But the moment I entered the sitting room, scanning the crowd for James's familiar face, my heart seemed to stop beating entirely. James and Charlotte were in the far corner near the French windows, embracing in a way that was unmistakably intimate. Not the casual hug of friends, but the close, lingering embrace of lovers. Charlotte's head was tilted back as she laughed at something he'd whispered in her ear, and his hand was resting possessively on the small of her back. I stood there in the doorway, clutching a bottle of wine I'd brought as a gift, watching the man I'd planned to marry gazing at my cousin, as if she were the only woman in the world. The noise of the party seemed to fade into a distant hum, and I felt as if I were watching the scene through thick glass, disconnected from reality. Charlotte had never shown the slightest romantic interest in James before that night. In fact, she'd often teased me about him, calling him too serious, too bookish, too intense. She'd always assured me that we were friends, that she supported my relationship and wanted to see me happy. "You two are perfect for each other," she'd said on more than one occasion. "He needs someone steady like you to keep him grounded." But standing there watching them together, everything suddenly made perfect sense with horrible clarity. The way Charlotte had always insisted on joining us when we went out for dinner, the excessive interest she'd shown in James's academic work, asking detailed questions about his research into medieval history, the way she dressed when she knew he'd be around. Never obvious, but always looking particularly stunning in that effortless way she had. All those little moments I'd dismissed or rationalized came flooding back, the meaningful glances I'd caught them exchanging when they thought I wasn't looking, the inside jokes that seemed to exclude me, the way conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room. How could I have been so blind? I'd fled the party that night, mumbling some excuse about feeling unwell, and spent the weekend in my bedsit crying and trying to convince myself that I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. But James called me the following Monday to break up with me, his voice gentle but firm over the telephone. "I'm so sorry," he'd said, and I could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "You're a wonderful person. Truly you are. But I've realized I have feelings for someone else. It wouldn't be fair to either of us to continue our engagement when my heart isn't fully in it." He'd been too much of a gentleman to mention Charlotte by name, but he didn't need to. Within a month, they were seen together at university functions, at theater premieres, at all the sort of intellectual gatherings that James loved and I'd always found rather intimidating. They made a striking couple, both tall, both elegant, both possessed of that effortless sophistication that I'd never quite managed to achieve. And now, years later, Mother was actually rewarding Charlotte for that betrayal, increasing her inheritance if she married the man she'd stolen from me. The pain of that old wound, which I'd thought had healed over time, tore open with renewed intensity. I felt physically sick, as if someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with iron fingers. But there was more to discover in the hidden will. As I continued reading through my tears, another paragraph revealed information that made me gasp aloud in the empty room. Furthermore, I wish to acknowledge that James has been made aware of these provisions and has agreed to consider Charlotte's proposal of marriage should she choose to make one. He has been a loyal friend to our family for many years, and I believe this arrangement would be beneficial to all parties concerned. James knew about this. James was complicit in Mother's bizarre scheme. The betrayal cut even deeper than Charlotte's original theft of my fiancé. Not only had he left me for her, but he was now apparently willing to marry her for money, my money, taken directly from my inheritance. The room seemed to spin around me as I tried to process this information. Everything I'd believed about James, about his character and integrity, crumbled like a house of cards in a strong wind. The gentle, scholarly man who'd written me poetry was apparently quite capable of cold calculation when it came to financial gain. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. With the second will clutched firmly in my hands like a piece of evidence in a criminal case, I reached for the telephone on Mother's writing desk and dialed James's number, a number I'd memorized years ago and had never quite managed to forget, despite my best efforts. It had been years since I'd heard his voice, perhaps a decade since we'd last spoken. I'd deliberately avoided the social circles where we might encounter each other, and London was large enough that our paths had never crossed accidentally. With each ring of the telephone, anxiety mounted in my chest like a gathering storm. He answered on the fourth ring, and the sound of his voice transported me instantly back to university days. Hello? It was the same voice, perhaps a bit deeper with age, but unmistakably James, that slight Yorkshire accent he'd never quite lost despite his years at Oxford. James, it's me. I could barely get the words out, my throat tight with emotion. There was a pause that seemed to last an eternity. In the background, I could hear classical music playing. Bach, I thought, which was typical of James. Good heavens, it's been absolutely ages. Yes, rather a long time, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tempest of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I know this might seem strange, calling you out of the blue like this, but I needed to speak with you about something rather urgent. Of course. Is everything all right? You sound upset. How like James to notice the emotional undertones in my voice, even after all these years. It was one of the qualities that had drawn me to him initially, his sensitivity to other people's feelings, his genuine concern for their well-being. I took a deep breath and launched into an explanation of the situation. I told him about Mother's death, about the will reading at Mr. Pemberton's office, about finding the hidden addendum behind the photograph. I explained about the clause that would increase Charlotte's inheritance if she married him, about Mother's reference to his agreement to consider such an arrangement. When I finished speaking, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could picture James in his study, wherever he lived now, probably surrounded by books and papers, his brow furrowed in that way it did when he was processing complex information. I had absolutely no idea about any of this, he said finally, his voice low and shocked. Your mother never mentioned anything about a will, about inheritance provisions, about anything of the sort. But the document specifically states that you've been made aware of these provisions, I pressed, rereading the relevant passage. It says you've agreed to consider Charlotte's proposal if she makes one. I can assure you, with complete certainty, that I have never been informed of any such arrangement, James replied firmly, and I certainly haven't agreed to anything of the kind. The very idea is, well, it's rather mercenary, isn't it? Relief flooded through me like cool water on a hot day. Whatever game Mother and Charlotte had been playing, James apparently wasn't a willing participant. But that raised even more questions about Mother's motives and Charlotte's involvement. Are you two together now? The question burned in my throat like acid, but I had to know. No, we're not together, James replied quickly. We went out to dinner a few times some months ago, old friends catching up, nothing more. But it didn't lead anywhere romantic. Honestly, I haven't seen or spoken to Charlotte in several weeks. More relief, followed immediately by a fresh wave of confusion. If James and Charlotte weren't romantically involved, what was the point of Mother's strange provision? Why structure the inheritance around a marriage that seemed unlikely to occur? James, I said hesitantly, do you think Charlotte might have influenced Mother somehow? Convinced her to write the will this way? Another long pause. I wouldn't want to speculate about such a serious matter, he said carefully. But I will say that your mother seemed rather concerned about Charlotte's future the last few times I saw her. She mentioned something about wanting to ensure Charlotte would be taken care of, that she'd always felt guilty about something in the past. Guilty about what? What secret was Mother carrying that would make her feel obligated to favor Charlotte so dramatically in her will? Would you be willing to help me get to the bottom of this? I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I feel like there's something we're not seeing, some piece of the puzzle that's missing. Of course, James replied without hesitation. Your mother was always kind to me, and this situation is frankly bizarre. I'd like to understand what's really happening here as much as you would. After we'd arranged to meet the following day, I hung up the telephone, feeling both relieved and more confused than ever. James's response had been exactly what I'd hoped for. He was as mystified by the situation as I was, and he was willing to help me investigate. But Mother's motivations remained completely opaque. I decided to confront Charlotte directly before taking any other action. If there were family secrets involved, if there was some hidden history that explained Mother's behavior, Charlotte would be the most likely person to know about it. She'd always been Mother's confidant in a way that I'd never quite managed to achieve. I dialed Charlotte's number, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed each digit. The telephone rang twice before she answered, her voice carrying its usual musical quality. "Hello? Charlotte, it's me," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. There was a brief pause, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed subtly. "Oh, hello. This is rather unexpected. How are you holding up after yesterday's unpleasantness?" Unpleasantness? Was that how she characterized learning that she'd inherited virtually everything while I received a pittance? "I need to see you," I said bluntly. "Tonight, if possible. There are things we need to discuss about Mother's will." "I thought everything was quite straightforward," Charlotte replied carefully. "Mr. Pemberton seemed to cover all the essential points." "Did he? Because I've discovered some information that suggests the situation is rather more complicated than it appeared yesterday." Another pause, longer this time. "What sort of information?" "The sort that's better discussed in person. Can you meet me at Willowbrook this evening?" I suppose so. Around 8 o'clock? Perfect. And Charlotte? Come alone." I spent the remaining hours until Charlotte's arrival walking through the manor, trying to piece together the puzzle of Mother's strange bequest. Every room held memories, but now I found myself looking at them through a different lens, searching for clues about the relationship between Mother and Charlotte that I might have missed. In the conservatory, I remembered Mother teaching Charlotte how to repot orchids. The two of them bent over the delicate plants with shared concentration. In the kitchen, I recalled Charlotte helping Mother prepare elaborate dinner parties, the two of them working together with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. In the library, I could picture them having hushed conversations that would stop whenever I entered the room. Had there always been secrets between them? Had I been deliberately excluded from some crucial aspect of their relationship? Charlotte arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, dressed in an elegant black coat that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in 6 months. She looked composed as always, but I noticed she was carrying a handbag large enough to hold documents, an unusual choice for someone who claimed to know nothing about additional complications to the will. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting, which was probably true. I'd been crying on and off all day, and my reflection in the hallway mirror had revealed red-rimmed eyes and disheveled hair. "I've had rather a shocking day," I replied, leading her into the sitting room where I'd made the discovery. "Please, sit down. There's something I need to show you." I handed her the hidden page of the will without preamble, watching her face carefully as she read. Her expression remained neutral for the first few lines, but I caught the slight widening of her eyes when she reached the paragraph about James, the almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth when she read about the inheritance increase. "Where did you find this?" she asked when she'd finished reading, her voice carefully controlled. "Hidden behind that photograph," I said, pointing to the frame that still lay on the side table where I'd left it. "Rather an odd place to hide crucial legal documents, don't you think?" Charlotte set the paper down carefully, smoothing it with hands that weren't quite steady. "I suppose Mother had her reasons." "Yes, I'm sure she did. The question is, what were those reasons? And how much did you know about them?" For a long moment, Charlotte said nothing, staring at the Persian carpet as if it held the answers to life's great mysteries. When she finally looked up, her composed mask had slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been guilt or fear. "I knew there was more to the will than what was read yesterday," she admitted quietly. "The confession hit me like a physical blow. You knew. You knew, and you said nothing, while I sat there believing I'd been virtually disinherited?" "It wasn't like that," Charlotte protested, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't know the specific details. Mother mentioned that she'd made some additional provisions, but she never showed me this document." "But you knew it existed." "I suspected something, yes. Mother had been acting strangely the past few months, asking odd questions about my future plans, about whether I ever thought about marriage. About James specifically. About James? She'd been asking about James? Charlotte nodded reluctantly. She seemed fixated on the idea that I should settle down, that I needed security. She kept mentioning how suitable James would be, how he'd always been fond of our family. This was news to me. In the months before Mother's death, she'd never mentioned James to me at all, but apparently, she'd been discussing him extensively with Charlotte. Did she ever explain why she was so concerned about your future? I pressed. You have a successful career, your own flat, your own money. Why would she feel you needed additional security? Charlotte's composure cracked further, and for the first time since we were children, I saw genuine vulnerability in her expression. Because she felt guilty, she whispered. Guilty about something that happened years ago. What kind of guilt? The kind that comes from keeping secrets, Charlotte replied, her voice barely audible. The kind that eats away at you for decades until you feel compelled to make amends, even if those amends don't make rational sense to anyone else. A chill ran down my spine. What secrets, Charlotte? She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her internal struggle playing out across her features. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. There's something I need to tell you, she said, reaching into her handbag and withdrawing an envelope. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of how you'd react, afraid of what it would mean for our relationship, afraid of destroying the only family I've ever known. She handed me the envelope with trembling hands. It was old, yellowed with age, and addressed to Charlotte in Mother's handwriting. The postmark was dated 22 years ago. What is this? Read it, Charlotte said simply, and then you'll understand everything. With growing trepidation, I opened the envelope and withdrew the letter inside. It was written on Mother's personal stationery, and the date confirmed it had been written shortly after Father's death, when I was still at university. My dearest Charlotte, the letter began, and as I read on, my understanding of everything, my family, my past, my relationship with Charlotte, began to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to sudden light. I can no longer bear the weight of this secret, the letter continued. You deserve to know the truth about your parentage, about why I have always loved you as more than a niece, about why your welfare has always been so important to me. Charlotte, my darling girl, you are not my niece. You are my daughter. The words seemed to float off the page, rearranging themselves before my eyes as my brain struggled to process their meaning. Charlotte was Mother's daughter? That made her my